This week's topic is persuasion. We'll be looking at both the art and the science behind persuasion. The scientific literature so far doesn't suggest a simple one solution fits all means of persuasion. Instead, theorists propose that there are two basic ways of trying to persuade people, or two routes to persuasion. The first theory we'll look at is called the Elaboration Likelihood Model, or ELM. And this model classifies the two routes of persuasion as the central route and the peripheral route. So we'll look at more definition on that in a minute. The second theory we'll be looking at is the HSM theory, or the heuristic semantic model. And this model divides the different routes of persuasion into the systematic and the heuristic routes. And we'll talk about each of those. So according to that first theory, the elaboration likelihood model, the central route, which is really the same thing as the systematic route in the heuristic semantic model, happens when people think carefully and deliberately about what the content of the message is. So by central, they mean you're actually mentally processing it. So here we have again the central route, and these next few slides are going to relate to number 19 and 20 on your study guide, definitely. So the central route, or the systemic route, is the route of persuasion where people think very carefully and deliberately about the content. So they're cognitively processing it and to see how convincing the argument is. So they're attending to things like logic, how strong the arguments are or how weak they are, as well as to any other related evidence of the principles. The peripheral route, you know that periphery means on the outside of, okay, so anything outside of the central route is a peripheral route. It's the same thing as the heuristic route of the HSM model. People that are using the peripheral route in listening to a persuasive message primarily are paying attention to the peripheral cues or aspects of the message, which tend to be relatively superficial compared to a message. So they may be paying attention to things like the way the person is communicating, how fast they talk, how slow they talk, how engaging they are, whether or not they have a cute dog with them or a picture of a baby behind them. Those are all peripheral cues that don't engage our logic, but that can persuade us to change our mind about something or to be convinced of something just because they are cues that are very positive. More on the peripheral or heuristic route. So this is where we attend to cues in the environment that are really easy to process mentally. We don't have to think deeply about them. So thus the term heuristic is that it's based on memories that we already have stored, rules of thumb as far as understanding our world. So with the peripheral route, attractiveness can actually be a very convincing cue. So the attractiveness of the presenter could influence a person to be persuaded in a certain direction. It can be the actual physical attractiveness, or it can be that the speaker uses humor or other cues that are attractive. Now here we have the dual process approach to persuasion model. And this kind of shows you whether it's the central or the peripheral route. the motivation and ability factors involved. And we're going to be talking in the next frame a little bit about what that is. And then the factors promoting attitude change for each. So you can see with the central or systematic routes, the issue is personally, if the issue is personally relevant, that's going to be more likely to be processed through the central route. If the issue is not relevant, it tends more likely to be influenced by peripheral heuristic cues. If the listener is knowledgeable on the subject, then they're more likely to mentally process the information, so it's more likely to go through the central route. If an individual is distracted or just tired, then they're going to be more influenced by heuristic cues and not able to really mentally examine the points that the speaker makes. And also, if the message is not complete or if it's hard to understand, many times people use really complex language or jargon that most people aren't familiar with. The listener is going to be more likely to be influenced by peripheral cues and not to really process that jargon or complex language. So through the central or systematic route, the factors that promote attitude change the most for the central route is the quality of the argument. How convincing are the points that the speaker makes? Or if they're not convincing, a person can be persuaded not to buy into the argument if it is too weak. When the peripheral route is engaged, cues like how attractive the source is, the speaker, how famous they are, if they're a celebrity, or if they have certain expertise, those are going to promote attitude change. The number and length of arguments can also play a role through the peripheral route, and consensus. So if it appears that other people are being persuaded, or the speaker lists other people that have already been persuaded, then the peripheral, through the peripheral process, persuasion is likely to take place. So we're going to talking about what these terms are: motivation and ability. So we're talking about the listener, the person that's there to possibly be persuaded. What determines whether we will engage in central or peripheral processing? The motivation, what brings them to listen to this message, and their ability to engage. Number 21 asks you about what the conditions are that increase the chance that a person will use the central route. And so we'll be speaking to that. So we have to be both motivated and able to engage in more in-depth processing that's demanded through the central route. If either one is lacking or both, then persuasion is usually going to be processed through the peripheral route. So for longer lasting attitude change, the central route is much more preferable. When motivation and or ability is limited, then we're more likely to be motivated for peripheral processing, attending to peripheral cues rather than the content of the message itself and the logic behind it. And here again are some of those same conditions I listed before that are related to peripheral processing. We're much more likely to process things without thinking about them. If we're distracted, tired, if the message is incomplete, or if it's hard to understand, if the topic is actually not relevant to us, but the speaker has a high level of expertise, then we may be persuaded, but through the peripheral route without considering the logic behind the argument. The elements of a persuasive attempt are the source of the message, or the who, the content of the message, or the what, and the audience of the message, or the whom. So we'll be talking about each of these. We'll be talking about source characteristics, message characteristics, and audience characteristics. Source characteristics is about the person that's trying to persuade. They're the characteristics of the person who's delivering the message. So they can be such characteristics as how attractive they are, how credible they seem to be, and how certain they are. Let's look at attractiveness first. We have an awful lot of social psychology research that shows that attractiveness is an advantage in getting your point across. Attractive spokespeople tend to be more persuasive even for topics that are unrelated to attractiveness. And the effects of attractiveness, of course, are processed through that peripheral route. There's nothing about the way the person looks that would persuade you in a direction through some kind of deep processing, but it's more of a heuristic kind of route. In study after study, participants rate speakers more favorably the more attractive they are. And those favorable feelings then become associated with the message, whether it's a product or whether it's convincing you to change your behavior in some way. Credibility is another source characteristic, and this is when we see people as being experts in their field and trustworthy, then they're more persuasive. Non-credible sources, unfortunately though, can change our attitudes also through what we call the sleeper effect. And the sleeper effect happens when we hear a message and at first we discount it because we don't think that the presenter is credible. We don't think they're an expert. So we think, well, it's not really a good source. But then later on, we remember what the speaker has said, but we forget who actually said it. We forget the source of that information. So it can have a sleeper effect in that later on we can become convinced, even though it's not a credible source. And then the certainty of the speaker is really important, or the confidence with which they give their message. So people that express their views with a lot of confidence tend to be much more persuasive than others. So if your goal is to persuade someone, try to express a lot of confidence behind it. So we'll be looking at message characteristics next, and I see we only have about another minute on this video, so I will save message characteristics for the next lecture in this series.